All right, thank you everyone for attending the community meeting for Justice for Brentwood. As I mentioned in the chat, my name is Katasha Davis. I'm gonna take on the hosting duties for Parisa along with Sabrina Rhodes. And I'm gonna start off with just a couple of sort of brief announcements. So if you haven't already, please introduce yourself in the chat. I know normally we go around, but we have a couple presentations tonight, and so we want to make sure we get through everything, but still have a chance to introduce ourselves. So please do so in the chat. The second thing I want to mention, particularly for some of the residents on the call, we currently have the Health Impact Assessment Survey. This is a reminder to please take that survey. We want to get at least 200 residents to take it. Right now, I think we have about 40 residents. So Sabrina, can you please put the link to the Survey Monkey in the chat? And we'll continue to put that in as the call goes on. So because I suspect that we'll continue to have people joining as we have right now. So one of the things that Parisa mentioned to us is she sent us a couple of early looks at the data that I can share with you all now. So I'm going to share my screen just to give you a look at just two of the questions that we have data from. So just give me one moment. Okay, so the first one that she sent is, do environmental conditions affect your comfort level spending time outside in Brentwood? So how comfortable do you feel sitting outside given Brentwood's environmental conditions? And so you see, you know, this looks around 33% of people said uncomfortable. Sort of about 31 said neither uncomfortable or comfortable. So there seems to be just a little bit of leaning towards people feeling uncomfortable spending time outside in Brentwood. A second one, what is your comfort level opening your windows due to the air quality in Brentwood? And you see, you know, most of the respondents said they feel uncomfortable, almost 50% of them, right? And so this is the kind of data that we're trying to get. Right now, we only have 41 respondents. So in order to get a sort of representative sample of the community, which is around, I think between 2,000 and 3,000 people, we need at least 200. So we want to recommend folks, you know, tell your neighbors, their friends who live in Brentwood to please take the survey. In addition, I'm going to have paper surveys out this weekend during our community cookout. So if you see me out there and you haven't taken the survey, please come take it. Great. And then my last announcement is that we're going to be recruiting Brentwood residents for the Justice for Brentwood Steering Committee. We meet about twice a month in the evenings over Zoom. So it's really a low commitment, but we really need more residents to get involved. So if you know people who would be really interested or good at being on the steering committee or anything like that, please send them our way. We could use some more folks. All right, so with that, I'm gonna get to, we have a lot of presentations tonight and some really cool folks on the call. So for the next 20 minutes, we wanna talk about the heat island effect and its impact on Brentwood. And so we have two folks on the call from the Union of Concerned Scientists. One, I'm really sorry if I get your last name wrong, but I think it's Juan de Clipereto. I'm working on my Spanish, so this is actually really important to me.
That's great, thank you.
Yeah, great. Awesome. And so I'm going to hand it over to you, Declan. And I think Juan, and you can share your screen as needed.
Thank you. Let's see. Yeah, the other Union of Concerned Scientist staff person here is Kevin Chen. I don't see everybody. I assume that he's here on the call. How do I share my screen? Oh boy. Hang on a second. Give me a second. I am trying to share my screen among my multiple windows. Okay, can you see that? Can you see that full screen? No.
Yeah, we see the PowerPoint.
All right, can you see a full screen?
Yes.
Okay, great, thank you. Well, thank you for inviting me over here today to talk about something that I've been interested in and working on for a long time. I am a senior social scientist for climate vulnerability with the Union of Concerned Scientists. We're a national scientific advocacy group working to use policy for a healthy planet and a healthy population. I want to talk a little bit about urban heat islands. It's something I've been researching for a while, and I'm really glad to have the opportunity to put our science in the service of communities. And I hope to be able to come out of this with a strong and healthy conversation about how to argue for equitable solutions to the climate crisis and to the way that urban heat islands are impacting folks in Ivy City and Brentwood. I'll start with a little bit of a national sort of scope. Globally and nationwide, extreme heat is on the rise. This summer, a large part of the country has been under a large number of extreme heat alerts, as shown here in this map that we've been collecting data to keep track of. Although the district only saw three, or the DMV region basically only saw some between 3 and 4 heat alerts issued by the local National Weather Service offices. These are likely to increase due to climate change. So we'll zoom in a little bit more then to talk about how heat affects the body and how urban heat islands are being exacerbated by climate change impacts. The risk of experiencing heat-related illness or injury begins to rise when the heat index, or the feels-like temperature, which is a combination of temperature and humidity, exceeds 80 Fahrenheit. Our body's responses to extreme heat are very individual and depend on things like our age and fitness level, how acclimated we are to extreme heat, how much we're exerting ourselves, and whether we have any underlying health conditions. Now, that being said, in general, as the heat index rises, more and more people become susceptible to heat-related illnesses. For example, with the heat index above 90, outdoor workers, people who spend their time working outdoors in all sorts of activities like first responders, delivery folks, farm workers, construction workers, landscape workers, and so on, are at risk of heat-related illness. Above 100, young people, elderly adults, and people with underlying health conditions such as cardiovascular disease have a heightened risk. Above 105, basically anybody who is, regardless of their physical ability or well-being, is at risk of a heat stroke or any bad complications from extreme heat. So what does this have to do with the urban heat island? So what we have at the global level, the national level, we have global climate change. That there's a different scale climate change that happens in cities as cities become developed, as basically natural land covers like agricultural fields and grass and dirt are turned into the built environment, into roadways, into streets and pavement and buildings and parking lots and so on. And it's called the urban heat island because when you look at a map of temperatures between the urban built-up environment and the surrounding rural countryside, it resembles an ocean of lower temperatures and an island of higher temperatures. It's sort of a metaphor that urban climatologists coined some time ago to describe it. But those are not the only differences that are important. There are other differences that are important because the same phenomenon occurs within cities. There's not just a gradient of temperatures between the hot city and the surrounding rural areas, but also within the city, there's considerable differences in surface temperatures that are directly tied to the surfaces in the city. This thermal maps of 2 neighborhoods in Phoenix, Arizona, show how inequitably distributed the urban heat island is in cities. The image on the left side is a predominantly Hispanic neighborhood. As you can see in the legend, the redder it gets, the hotter is the signature of the the higher the heat signature or the surface temperature there. The neighborhood on the right is a much wealthier, whiter neighborhood. You can make out lots of smaller streets, more cul-de-sacs, maybe a golf course or two, some more mountain areas. So you can see that there is very significant differences in the heat profile of neighborhoods that are in an area like Phoenix, which is a lot more spread out and less densely populated than the eastern cities and DC. Certainly, these 2 neighborhoods are probably like 2 or 3 miles apart only, yet the differences are vast. Now, who's more sensitive to extreme heat? So public health research tells us very clearly that some persons, due to their underlying physiology, age, and living conditions, are more prone to become ill or die during extreme heat episodes from heat or from underlying conditions that can be triggered during extreme heat events. So sometimes persons who have underlying health conditions such as diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular disease, those conditions can be triggered by extreme heat episodes. So let's talk about something that's at the heart of the research that I've conducted, not so much specifically to DC, somewhat in DC, but in a couple of different areas across the country, about what are the root causes of urban heat islands disparities and impacts. So while we see from basic urban climatology that the differences in urban heat island intensity happen because of the land cover differences of different sorts of surfaces that absorb heat at different rates. For example, pavement will absorb and emit heat at a different rate than if you had a tree in the same area, or if you had grass, right? So those are the physical geography, sort of the physical climatology reasons, but those are not the root causes. The root causes lie in decisions that have been made by policymakers that have made decisions about who gets to live where and what sorts of investments go or do not go in some places. In general, we can argue that environmental injustices in DC, just like in many other cities across the country, have been created by racism and segregation. This is a map that many of you may be familiar with from Mapping Segregation DC, showing racially restricted covenants and housing in the 1940s in the U.S. You know, there are other ways of looking at the data here, but in general, this shows us a picture of the role of residential segregation in keeping people in poverty for a long amount of time. Now, I put this map here in this separate slide for us to take a look at. Well, many of you may probably have read about redlining and the impact of redlining in denying mortgages systematically to people of color, specifically Black Americans, for a long time in a now illegal practice that dated since the 1930s. There are no maps for DC that are available. While there are many maps for many areas of the country, many cities to show the impact of redlining and show redline areas, which were inherently racist policies because the only criteria to deny a mortgage to a person was the color of their skin. While we don't have those maps specifically for DC, it's pretty hard to imagine that DC was not that the Black residents of DC were not subjected to the same sort of racist practices, right? So the maps here can help us, create a mental picture of what many of you as residents of DC probably know already, that it's a very segregated city, that as the areas in the map change in color intensity from the darker colors in the legend to the lighter colors, and this is a very old map, right? This is not particularly pretty cartography, but it shows very clearly that these areas have been graded, and they were graded basically in very similar ways as the redlining sort of criteria were graded. Basically, areas were downgraded or redlined based on the percentage of people of color in them. So one of the things that I like to think about, like to talk about is, well, what does this have to do with creating hotter environments? Well, so redlining as a policy is it's not the only policy that created hotter environments for people of color, but together with segregation, together with systematic denial of mortgages to people, together with the disinvestment that followed the inability of people of color specifically, or especially Black residents, to obtain mortgages, then there was a lot of disinvestment that didn't also translate into parks, green spaces, good schools, and the things that people enjoy and want to see in their neighborhoods. So that sort of chronic disinvestment had this twofold impact by denying the accumulation of multi-generational wealth to Americans of color through the redlining policies, but also it's resulted in a huge disinvestment in many neighborhoods of color across the country. Go on to the next one. So today in DC, we have, as in many cities across the U.S., populations that are vulnerable to extreme heat who also live in the hottest neighborhoods. The maps on the left from a policy brief that I co-wrote with some colleagues a couple of years ago to help inform the district's climate action plan. The maps here combine, the maps on the left combine the characteristics of the built environment that make neighborhoods hotter. That's what we refer to as the heat exposure index. With the social and demographic characteristics of people who are more sensitive to heat, such as those characteristics that I showed earlier. The pink to red colors in the cumulative in the map on the right, which is a sort of summation of the two maps on the left, then allow us to identify the combination of those two factors. By the way, IVCD registers on the red, of course, Ward 5, right? On the red in the legend, which is the highest combination of both exposure, which means higher land surface temperatures, less vegetation, so those neighborhoods get hotter, then with a higher population sensitivity because there are lots of folks who live in poverty without air conditioning access, of advanced age, and so on. And some, not all, but some of the factors that public health literature and research has identified as putting people at higher risk for extreme heat. So let's talk about some solutions at the federal level, because we are an advocacy-focused organization, and we don't just want to tell people about how bad things are or have been, but we want to talk about solutions because we have solutions that we can that can be implemented. At the federal level, I'll briefly mention the results for DC from UCS's Killer Heat work from 2019, which found that with action on climate to reduce planet warming emissions, we can limit the worst impacts of heat for DC. And I won't go too much into this because these results do not consider urban heat islands in any parts of the country. But this is just to reinforce the point that emissions reductions are the main thing that are going to are the only thing that are going to get us to avoid the worst of climate change. Now let's go back then to local solutions. So at the local level in DC, there are opportunities for engagement. Of course, you probably may know already about Climate Ready DC, the district's climate action plan. There are a number of actions there to reduce urban heat island risk. For example, they intend to, or these are some of the goals that they have, or the ways to the strategies to develop thermal mapping of the district, to identify hotspots, urban heat island hotspots, vulnerable residents, and areas with the greatest potential for cooling. One of the solutions that they are looking for is also expanding green spaces, tree planting, and tree protection efforts, prioritizing hotspots in those areas with the greatest number of heat vulnerable residents. So definitely there is a equity component that's built in here, and this is where community involvement is crucial and critical to make sure that that is done. That has been my experience in Phoenix in engaging in the climate action plan, where continued engagement with the city from residents, from scientists such as myself, has resulted in a robust process that the city has developed that has equity at its heart. And I'll stop there. I didn't kind of race through that, and I didn't really know. I don't really know how, if I'm running late or if I run over my time, but I will stop there, and I would love to entertain some questions, to have some conversation about this. Thank you.
Great. Nope, you did not run over your time. Thank you so much. So I think we do have just like a couple minutes if anyone has a question or a comment. Maybe people a chance.
Thanks for the presentation, Juan. So I guess a question that I have, and sorry, my name's Shay Sahai. I work at a law firm called Foley Hoag. We're asset counsel to empower DC. But I guess the question I had is like, so what are the long-term kind of solutions for the urban heat island effect? Like, I mean, is it essentially changing the landscape, more tree planting, more green areas? Like, what's in the spectrum of solutions to reduce at least the kind of the heating effect?
Well, there are a number of solutions. Trees are certainly one of them, and there's no sort of like one size fits all solution for any city, because conditions are different, population vulnerability is different, what the people need is different, and the specific, conditions of, for example, how much water you have and so on are very different. For a city like so writ large, I think that we should be talking about a number of solutions that include trees and shading vegetation, increase access to green spaces, but also green roofs, cool roofs, and cool pavements, or any other sort of solution that can help, for example, increase albedo or the reflectivity of materials. Again, there's no magic bullet for this. And this is in the realm of adaptation, right? Of modifying the urban environment and the urban landscape to make it more habitable, to make it better for more livable for people. For example, I'll bring an example from Phoenix again. In Phoenix, which is it's a sprawling city with large, long streets and wide streets, that there's a need for cool corridors. It has been identified, a need for cool corridors to plant a whole bunch of trees and create canopy for people to walk from school to work, to the bus stop, to the shop, and so on. So those sort of solutions need to be put together holistically with the city, with residents, with scientific experts as well.
Okay, that's helpful. So on DC, would you how do you go about advancing those types of solutions? So are you kind of working on legislation to require them to be implemented in building codes? Or kind of what are you thinking on that front? And then as a side note, before you go to the DC answer, if you need kind of help with Phoenix outreach, I happen to be friends with the mayor and with one of the congressmen over there. So just keep that in mind and shoot me an email later if you want to talk about that.
Sure, certainly. I am not very familiar with the specific mechanisms, in DC legislation that could be advanced for that, but so that's not my area of expertise. But I will keep it broader, to center instead on a robust process that is inclusive, that helps expand a little bit the definition of expert, not just to people with advanced degrees such as myself, but our community residents, just Ivy City and Brentwood folks. They know their neighborhoods. They know how the problems that they face are not only urban heat island, that they are not disconnected from housing, from jobs, from transit, from economic development. To be able to see these problems more holistically and less siloed, because we're not going to solve those problems if we treat the urban heat island just as a microclimatological problem. The roots of that lie in racism and white supremacy and development focus on urban growth and profit making and not people.
Great. So we have one hand up. I'm gonna let Carol go, and then we gotta move on to our next presentation. But if you all can just put your questions in the chat, and Juan can answer them in the chat after Carol. And then also, Juan, if you can put your contact information in the chat as well, that'd be great. All right, Carol, go ahead.
Hi, just real quick, thanks for the presentation. And I wanted to just ask Juan, I think from, we're thinking about Brentwood and Ivy City and working with communities, some of the concepts of heat island and the health effects can sometimes be challenging for us to meet the residents where they understand what we're talking about. And I'm curious if there's a role for, Empower DC to really help communicate that risk. I work at EPA on a lot of framework on how do we know our audience and make sure that we are giving them real information that they can comprehend and take actions to protect themselves, right, from those effects that we know can happen from advanced heat, because we know that the solutions might be a long ways away, right? But I'm just wondering if you can see a role for folks like Katasha that actually talk resident to resident about what to do when the temperatures hit those degrees, to real actionable things that folks can do to protect their health.
Yeah, certainly there's a need for that kind of actionable information and data, right, and knowledge for the communities at the two broad scales in which this is needed, right? I think the last thing we were talking about was more like public health, individual behavioral modifications, which of course are important. There's a role for the community to check on the elders, right? Do welfare checks on the elders and so on, and children as well, or persons with disabilities and persons experiencing homelessness and all of that, right? But that has to go also together with the broader understanding that there is a need for large scale changes to our economy, to our transportation systems, to our energy systems, and that takes collective action, right? And one of the roles of an organization like the Union of Concerned Scientists is to take that science and make it actionable and useful for people. That's why I didn't come here talking about standard deviations, for example, right? Like nobody cares about that except for nerds like me. People care to know if their kids are going to be able to play soccer, or track or football outside, or they won't because it's unhealthy for them to do so. So that's a key role that we as scientists in federal government, academia, nonprofit sector can and should be playing to communicate that science and make it actionable. It's not just us handing out information to communities; it's us working together with the communities, with community experts like Katasha, to craft what that should look like for communities.
Great.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Juan, and thank you, Kevin, both from the Union of Concerned Scientists. We really appreciate you both coming today, and Juan, thank you for the presentation. So our next presentation is from Ryan Hand, who's from the Office of Planning. He's going to talk about the New York Avenue Framework. What is the framework, what it entails, how does this impact Brentwood, timelines of meetings and events. So Ryan, I already gave you co-hosting, so if you need to share anything, please feel free.
Well, thank you. I'm going to share a few slides, but before I do that, I just want to say thank you so much for having me today. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to this group. I'm the Senior Economic Planner at the DC Office of Planning, and I'm the project manager for the New York Avenue Northeast Vision Framework. I'm just going to share just a few slides here that I think will help. Some of you may have seen these slides before. So these slides are drawn from the kickoff meeting we had last Thursday on August 31st. I think it might be helpful just to frame what we're talking about here today. The area we're studying is New York Avenue from Florida Avenue to South Dakota. It's the area shown in coral here. The reason we're focusing on this area is last year, DC Council adopted an amended comprehensive plan. That amendment changed the district's policy for how this area can be used. And we're planning to help support that change. The area you're seeing in blue is a broader area that we're studying because we think these changes are pretty significant. And we want to make sure we're working with the communities that will benefit and maybe be challenged by some of these changes. And just go a little bit deeper here. The map we're showing here is what's called the future land use map. It's from the comprehensive plan. The comprehensive plan is a policy document that provides a long range policy framework for the district's growth. And what you're seeing on this map are the striped candy cane looking area. That's the area we're focusing on. Those stripes mean three different things. It means that high density residential buildings, high density commercial buildings, and production, distribution, and repair facilities are allowed in this area. And what we're planning for is the change that added the high density residential and high density commercial. You can see that this addition dovetails with some existing similar land use around Union Market. That's part of what's happening here. And we are having conversations about what these changes mean for the community, what benefits they may be able to generate, and what challenges we need to be looking out for so we can work together to solve them. One of the big things to point out is this change will take a lot of time. It'll probably take about 20 years to fully absorb these changes. This is a 3-mile long corridor. So it's a lot of area and a lot of possibility. And this is the beginning of a conversation. So I want to talk a little bit about what else is going on in the area. OP is conducting 3 studies along this area to really make sure we get it right. The vision framework is focused on the full corridor where these land use changes were made to understand what they mean to the district and the communities around them. The Ivy City Small Area Plan is taking a deep dive to needs and opportunities in the Ivy City community. That's the area we're seeing change happen first, and we make sure we're getting ahead of challenges in that community. The last piece is a production, distribution, repair land use study. This is basically an economic study to evaluate trade-offs for changes to the district's basically industrial land use policy. And the way we use that is that we expect to update the comprehensive plan around 2025. And we want that study to help us really understand what we can do to make changes in those areas. And those changes We want to make changes with an eye towards environmental justice and trying to make sure that we are supporting the district's economy in the way that it needs some of these functions, but also making sure we're driving equitable outcomes. I'm going to speak to one more slide and take a pause. We're addressing 4 goals specifically through the vision framework to advance racial equity. And what we mean by that is we really want to acknowledge the history of racism in planning and in other policy choices that affected this area. We are really looking towards the comprehensive plan and the equity forward language that's been added to the plan, both through through all the parties involved. There's a lot of really strong language from OP as well as the Council Office on Racial Equity that we think have made the document very strong. We're also breaking down data by race and ethnicity so that we can really understand the lived experience of people in the community as a starting place. And the most important part of the entire of our approach is that we want to make sure we're listening as much as possible and making space to hear what people in the community are experiencing, what's important to you. That's our guiding light as we work through this process, as hearing, then analyzing, and then aligning with their policy. So I'm going to pause here and see if there's any questions. All right. Thank you. And I'm going to just move forward a little bit more to talk about the schedule for this project. We have just started the project. Over the summer, we conducted some research that's informing the project. That research will be part of the final report. We're starting the engagement process right now. We had the first public meeting last week. We're having 2 more at the end of this month. One will be on September 22nd in the evening. It's a Thursday evening, and that meeting will run from 7 to 8:30 p.m. That'll be an online meeting. We'll have the exact same content for an in-person meeting on Saturday, September 24th at the Woodridge Library. We invite you to join whichever meeting is most convenient to you. You won't miss anything. If you join one or the other, you definitely don't need to come to both. We just want to make sure we're reaching as many people as possible. We're also conducting a series of walking tours and pop-up events. You'll see us around. There are 2 upcoming walking tours. One is this Saturday, and the second one is going to be on Thursday, the 15th. And I'll have more information for you on how to sign up for those. Pulling back out a little bit, we are studying how, specifically how these these land use changes might be used, so we can understand what maybe facilities and infrastructure as well as other impacts they may generate on the community. So we're really analyzing what in detail what to expect. Later this fall, we'll start developing recommendations, and we'll reach out to the community stakeholders by January to collect feedback on those recommendations. After we get that feedback, we're going to develop a document, and our goal is to release it by the end of April. I've touched on the community engagement. I'm going to provide a little more detailed information at the end of the presentation. So I think this this slide is maybe a little bit more helpful. And so I want to just highlight a couple of key points. I'm sorry, this one's off. Anyways, so as I mentioned, there are 4 opportunities that we are really emphasizing to be able to engage this project. The first one are the 2 walking tours I mentioned. You can sign up for those at the link at the top of this website, and I'll also drop that into the chat for everybody. And that website is where we'll provide all of we'll provide any meeting announcements as well as feedback to the community from the work we've been doing. The next 2 options are the larger meetings that we're talking about. It'd be great to have your input on those. And I look forward to talking, having more conversations with the community as we work through this process. And this is the biggest thing I want to emphasize now is this the very beginning. So I'm looking forward to the conversation. I'm looking forward to hearing your perspectives. I'm seeing a comment in the chat about community benefit agreements for affordable housing, anti-displacement are given great weight. Are now on the comp plan. So the areas we're specifically focusing on, the district has advanced a new land use policy called IZ Plus. Along New York Avenue, we expect about 20% of units along New York Avenue to be dedicated affordable. So, pretty high standard. And we are looking for opportunities to increase the amount and depth of affordable housing. So that's one area we're looking towards. In terms of community benefit agreements, that's something that we're certainly looking towards some of our better practices on how to support strong outcomes. Are there other questions? I'm seeing health impacts.
Yeah. Ryan from Caroline Gross Davis. She said, I have not heard you mention health impacts from all this development. Construction means air pollution.
That's, I appreciate you sharing that sentiment. It's, we're taking health into consideration. It's one of the things that we're really focused on and trying to figure out how we get better outcomes. I think that's something, this is a very important comment that, construction does have effects on the community. One of the places we're looking towards is being able to support more, a healthier environment that includes more trees, that includes more options to get around, and helps provide more access to services. So we want to have a conversation about, if this change happens, what do we need to make it successful? And we want to recognize that that living through a lot of construction has impacts as well.
Yeah, Ryan, thank you for your answer. And this is Carol Ann. And just as a reminder, thinking about, what we would have done if it was like, something with a Superfund site, we'd have our contractors would have a health and safety plan, right? So a community health and safety plan is something to think about. Like, how can we think about, to separate, where things are happening, where soil's being moved separate from people. So it's just something to kind of add to the conversation, because I think there are going to be obvious questions from the residents that live there, or at least if they haven't expressed it, they're thinking about it. And so that's just something for you to think about, especially knowing that this is going to be a long-term plan.
Thank you so much for sharing that idea. I've taken a note of it so that we can bring it back into our process.
Also, I just want to add the publicinput.com New York Avenue Vision Framework. We can ask those types of questions in that.
Absolutely. Yep. And, so the best way is there's an email address for our team. There's a team supporting this project. Feel free to email us. That's the best way to reach out to us. We do track the comments, but we don't get to them quite as quickly.
Is that email in the chat, Ryan?
I will drop it in the chat. It was at the end of my presentation, and I'll make sure I put that here for everybody else.
Thanks.
Well, thank you, Ryan. We really appreciate it. I'm sure folks I have some additional questions too about, like, if there's more houses, there's more traffic, right? More cars, more pollution. So, we're sending some questions your way for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great.
And we have a lot more conversations.
Sure.
This is definitely the beginning.
Yeah, sounds great.
Thank you for the time today.
Yeah, thank you, Ryan. Thanks so much.
Bye.
So our next presentation is on measuring air quality in Brentwood and why measuring carbon monoxide is not enough. So we have Professor Susan Annenberg here from the George Washington University to explain air quality analysis, the air quality analysis that DC conducted on the bus terminal assessment. And she'll explain, like an analysis of CO and some better approaches. So Susan, I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you all for being here and inviting me to participate in this. Really glad to be doing it. Hopefully we'll meet in person at some point. Very difficult to keep doing these things virtually, so hope to get that opportunity at some point. So I just wanted to start by saying that I only came to this recently, about several months ago, and learned that there was a report that I've been calling the Sullivan Report. So you'll hear me say that, the Sullivan Report that the city commissioned to study the air quality impacts of the potential bus terminal. And I just want to start with the background of that report because it has two important points that I want to make here. The first one is that the purpose of their analysis, as they wrote in the report, is to determine whether or not vehicle emissions resulting from the development of the bus terminal will result in exceedances of the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, or NAQS. The reason this is important is because there are health effects of air pollution far below the NAAQS. The NAAQS are way too high to be protective of public health right now. So just for an example, our PM 2.5, our fine particulate matter standard, is 12 micrograms per meter cubed. The World Health Organization guideline is 5. So we're 2.5 times looser than the World Health Organization guideline. That standard for PM 2.5 is actually being revised right now by the EPA. It's sitting with the Office of Management and Budget, and we expect it to be revised down, but still not revised down all the way down to 5, which is the World Health Organization guideline. So I just want to make this point that the Sullivan report really only focused on whether or not the additional air quality impacts of the proposed bus terminal would result in exceedances of the standard. It didn't really consider the health relevant concentrations of pollution. The second thing to note is that the analysis was conducted for carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide is a criteria air pollutant. That means it's a regulated air pollutant by the EPA for ambient air quality, but it's not really a concern for ambient air quality for a couple of reasons. Number one is that we have actually been very effective at removing carbon monoxide from tailpipes. So we have catalytic converters in all of our cars right now, and those have been very successful at removing carbon monoxide. The second reason is that CO is really more of a problem in poorly ventilated spaces. You would, be concerned about carbon monoxide when you're burning fuel indoors. It doesn't really get to high enough levels to be health damaging in the ambient environment, in the outdoor air. So this report was focused again on whether or not the air pollution impacts would exceed the NAAQS, which are far too high. And the analysis was conducted only for carbon monoxide and not other traffic-related air pollutants, which are more of a concern. So what are the traffic-related air pollutants that are more of a concern? That's fine particulate matter, or PM 2.5, and nitrogen dioxide, or NO2. Again, carbon monoxide is typically not a concern in the outdoor air because it doesn't reach high enough levels to cause health effects. There's a range of health effects that are associated with PM 2.5 and NO2 with fine particulate matter and nitrogen dioxide. It reaches all the way up to premature mortality, but of course that's just the tip of the iceberg and affects the smallest number of people. There's a much broader proportion of the population that is affected by non-fatal events. So emergency room visits, hospital admissions, heart attacks, doctor's visits, school absences, lost work days, all the way down to subclinical effects, things that you wouldn't even see a doctor for: lung function decrements, inflammation, cardiac effects. So air pollution really has a broad range of health outcomes. Some of them are observable and others are not so observable. The EPA conducts these 5-year reviews of these regulated air pollutants, and they go through very extensive, systematic, comprehensive reviews of the health effects literature for each major air pollutant. So for PM 2.5, for all the air pollutants, we have what the EPA calls the integrated science assessment. These are like 1,000-page documents that go through the entire body of health literature, and they develop causal determination. So they have a whole framework that they use to determine whether or not each air pollutant is causally associated with each health outcome. So I've just listed here for PM 2.5 and nitrogen dioxide the health outcomes that the most recent integrated science assessment conducted by the EPA found to be either causally associated or likely to be causally associated with these air pollutants. So for PM 2.5, we have cardiovascular effects, respiratory effects, nervous system effects, cancer, and premature mortality. And for nitrogen dioxide, we have respiratory effects. And that was based largely on the literature that NO2 is associated with increased incidence of pediatric asthma. That's new development of asthma among children. The DC Department of Energy and Environment operates 4 nitrogen dioxide monitors at 3 locations in the district and 6 PM 2.5 monitors at 5 locations. The closest monitor to Brentwood is the McMillan Reservoir site, which is about 1.5 miles away. The NO2 measurements at that site measured at about 10 parts per billion in 2019. And that's far below the EPA standard, which is about 53 parts per billion. But the EPA standard is 10 times higher than the World Health Organization guideline. It actually hasn't been revised since 1971, the EPA standard. So even though the entire country actually is below the EPA standard, that does not mean we're breathing healthy air. That just means that our standard is actually too high. So the measured level is above the World Health Organization guideline. For PM 2.5, the measured concentration is around 8 in 2019 and in 2021. That's again below the EPA standard of 12, but that EPA standard is in revision right now. We expect that to be coming out very soon. And again, the EPA standard is about 2.5 times higher than the World Health Organization guideline. So just because our concentrations are below the current EPA standard does not mean that we're breathing healthy air. A couple years ago, we used satellite data to try to fill in the gaps between the monitors and assess the health damages of air pollution across the district in 51 neighborhood groups. And the benefit of satellite data is that we have full spatial coverage. So we don't have this problem where you only have the monitors in 5 specific sites. Here we can get a continuous map of the entire district. And we combine that with disease rates, and we estimate air pollution attributable mortality rates for each of these 51 neighborhoods. And perhaps unsurprisingly, we saw the highest PM 2.5 mortality rates in neighborhoods that also had the highest percent of Black population. It, in fact, lined up almost exactly with the map of segregation in the district. This actually is largely driven by the underlying health conditions and not mostly driven by the spatial pattern of PM 2.5 concentrations. This just tells you that it's not only about PM 2.5 concentrations, it's also about the susceptibility of the population that's breathing those concentrations. For Brentwood in particular, I just took a look because we had already completed the study by the time I came to this project. We estimated that the PM 2.5 concentration was about 10. And the Brentwood ranked about 17th among these 51 neighborhoods for air pollution related all-cause mortality, 13th for asthma emergency department visits related to air pollution again, 7th for chronic obstructive pulmonary disease mortality, 17th for ischemic heart disease mortality, 14th for lung cancer mortality, and 7th for stroke mortality. All of these attributable to PM 2.5. So any additional PM 2.5 source in Brentwood could exacerbate these health risks and the inequities that we're seeing here. Nitrogen dioxide is also important, as I mentioned at the beginning. NO2 and PM 2.5 are two of the most important traffic-related air pollutants. And we actually have fewer monitors for NO2 in the district than we do for PM 2.5. So here we actually can observe nitrogen dioxide very well from space. It's really incredible, actually. So we developed a statistical model using the TROPE-OMI satellite and ground monitor data. And again, we developed this spatial map of NO2 concentrations in the district and well, in the wider area as well. We estimated that the NO2 concentration in the Brentwood neighborhood was about 9.5 parts per billion. That equates to the 96th percentile of nitrogen dioxide concentrations in the whole DC metropolitan area, and the 65th percentile of concentrations within the district. So just to conclude, any new buses, passenger vehicles, heavy duty trucks that we add to the area, these vehicles all emit nitrogen oxides and elemental carbon. These contribute to PM 2.5 and NO2. And PM and NO2 are associated with a range of health effects, including respiratory disease, birth outcomes, premature mortality, just to name a few. The list really goes on. The spatial distribution of these pollutants and their associated health risks is uneven across the district. And Brentwood is among the neighborhoods with air pollution levels and associated health impacts that are higher than the citywide average. So any additional air pollution emission source in Brentwood would exacerbate these traffic-related air pollutant levels and associated health risks to the local residents. And that's true even if the eventual concentrations are still below the EPA standards, these additional emissions and air pollution would still be associated with increased health risks. So thank you very much. Happy to take any questions.
Sure. Zooks, I know you have a question.
Oh, I'm applauding Susan.
Oh,
I think both your and Juan's presentations really emphasize, right, how it is a combination of what we're measuring in terms of air pollution or urban heat island effects and underlying, right, health conditions that exist there. And that's a really powerful way for both of you to have shown some inequities and the potential impacts that the additional pollution and additional parking lots as opposed to green space are going to have.
Thank you, Zooks.
Shay?
Hey, thanks, Katasha. And thanks for the wonderful presentation, Susan. That's exactly kind of the data I think we're gonna, that's helpful to us as kind of outside counsel. And I'd love to kind of continue the conversation with you outside of this group. But one question I had was, so presumably DC models CO only, because they must feel like CO is well correlated with other criteria pollutants, so that if you kind of have low CO levels, it's kind of reasonable proxy for everything else, and you can assume that everything else is low. Can you speak to that a little bit? Like, is the CO kind of well correlated with other pollutants or not?
That's a great question. Maybe others on the call know that better. I see Zeus nodding. You may want to jump in here. I do not use CO as a proxy for other traffic.
Yeah, it's weird, obviously. I've never seen it before in my life, but okay. So, but yeah. Okay.
To the extent they're correlated, I'm not sure. Maybe they are.
Okay.
Yes,
Carol?
that's a great question.
Sorry, so was someone speaking? Carol, was that you?
No, but I can ask my question. Thanks for your presentation. And I just wanted to kind of throw out there, I think, you know, Susan, you kind of throw out there that challenge that we have and perhaps changing the conversation, right? That compliance doesn't equal safe or protective. And I know from an agency, of course, I work for EPA, that can we start to change the information? We know that there's information out there for so communities, some of that work just needs to, can we get away from compliance means everything's okay? And so I think for Empower DC to try to, know that from the regulatory agencies, they're stuck with compliance, but I feel that enforcement isn't compliance assistance, right? Enforcement isn't always the answer. So there's also other conversations that can happen. So I just think that's a really great thing to keep on talking about, Susan, is, we know that our standards are on their way down. That's why we evaluate them. There is really no, there's no safe level of ground level ozone, right? So just keep that conversation going, and we need to start to change the conversation so our regulators can understand where the community is coming from.
Thank you, Carolyn. Great point. And just to add to that, our air quality monitoring network in the United States was never designed to try to pick up on inequitable distributions and pollution. They're really only
or local air pollution. It's regional air pollution. Right. Yes.
Right.
Yes, I totally agree with you.
Legally, that is what we rely on for attainment demonstrations. But that does not mean that other forms of data that fill in the gaps between the monitors can't be useful for EPA decision making. And so, the more that we just in the past 5 or so years, we have a booming field of new data sources from satellites and from low-cost sensors and sensors that are being driven around on Google Street View mapping cars now, as some of the folks on the call are a part of. So it's really a whole new world of being able to monitor neighborhood scale pollution.
And Susan, I do want to, and I've had these conversations locally. Remember, you can reach out to our EPA folks that do this for a living. You can't pay us to be on your research. It's the job that we do, but we really can help you understand some of the monitoring networks, our challenges with sensors. So definitely, reach out to our state or at least EPA partners. We're doing a lot of work on purple air sensors, et cetera. So we can be a really good partner in understanding our data and the biases or the flaws in our data if you talk to the right folks. So I think it's a promise in the future that you can research and academics should reach out to their public partners so that you can better utilize our data to tell the story that you want to tell. That we don't control the story, but we can help you, be more accurate with the things that we have set up, and to give you some of that bias.
Thank you. So we have to move to our next presentation. So Dr. Phoenix, Dr. Zooks is going to give us some data on black carbon. So I'm wondering if you could just hold your question and then we can come back to it just so we can make sure we get to the data that she has.
Natasha, thanks. Yes. Actually, you've given me more time than I need. So is it okay if I give the floor to Janet?
Yes. All right, Dr. Phoenix, go ahead.
Right. So my comment really kind of followed up on what Carol had to say. I think there have been times in the past when some jurisdictions have adopted standards that are stricter than the federal standard for various pollutants. And I'm thinking that, there may be an argument to be made that DC ought to do the same, especially since we have, so many communities that are experiencing inequitable detriments because of, these pockets of poor air quality that are not evenly distributed across the city. So I guess my question, Susan, is, are you aware of any folks who are kind of in this, in your field and in other jurisdictions where they may have been able to successfully convince their policymakers that a stricter standard makes sense for some of these trap pollutants?
Yeah, great question, Janet. There's certainly state-based regulations to bring emissions down. Setting standards is a different question that really is only done on a national level. Interestingly, DC was the only district that I've ever heard of to try to claim an exceptional event for pollution that was too low during the pandemic. Meaning that they should not be, it's sort of a convoluted thing, but the pollution dropped during the pandemic, and the DC government argued that that the pollution levels we shouldn't be using that exceptional year to determine what pollution levels are in the district because it was too low. So normally I think most districts would actually take that and say, hey, pollution dropped, we're cleaner here. DC went the other way. And I think that's really indicative, actually, that, and sort of where the city's overall perspective is on this.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Hamburg. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. So I'm going to move to Dr. Zooks from Trinity, who's going to talk about the monitoring that we've been doing on black carbon in Brentwood.
Hi. So as many of you know, the purple air monitoring for PM 2.5 has been ongoing for quite a period of time, but more recently we set up black carbon monitors. So I wanted to make sure that everybody knew that these data are being collected. And what I have here are the data for black carbon, right, which is like the city portion of PM 2.5 that comes primarily from diesel trucks or biomass burning. And I've mapped it out. The red lines are sort of hourly averages, but you can see that there's also spikes, right, that are happening in short periods. So I wanted to point out a couple of patterns that are happening here. because I think it does reflect some of the air quality problems we have. So these lines right here are noon, meaning that right smack in between is at midnight. And when I saw these data, I was actually quite surprised because there's several times right before midnight and in the middle of the night when that black carbon is actually quite high. And this is something I want to take a look at because last time I went to go visit Ms. Sharon and her black carbon monitor, there were diesel trucks parked on, is it W Street, right? And I think they're just sitting there idling. That's illegal for them to be idling for more than 3 minutes. And so this is potentially capturing some of the footprint from that illegal idling. So a couple of points. One, I just want to ask residents and tell residents that, you know, we're collecting these data, but your data are just as important, if not more important. Like if you notice these things like idling and write them down and we're able to say like, wow, that was the day when residents actually noticed a whole bunch of trucks idling on W Street. Then we can start to try to link our observations here, right, to things that DC should be managing. And my second point is that I was hoping this could also be useful. Shay asked a really good question, right, about whether or not carbon monoxide levels, right, map onto other pollutants. So I think black carbon does map onto carbon monoxide because they're both from emission sources. PM 2.5, on the other hand, because it has a salad of all sorts of different contributions to it, is not going to map on nicely to black carbon. Black carbon's only a portion of it. But I think that hopefully these data will be able to be combined with measurements that people do maybe in shorter time periods that have a panel of pollutants. We can actually start to map out what things are like for folks. That also brings me to Shay's question. Am I over time, Katasha? That brings me to Shay's question about monitoring air toxics. I'm very interested in monitoring air toxics, especially after Ms. Sharon told me that the air was so bad the other day. She said for 2 days, she just thought she was going to throw up, right? So if these smells that people are experiencing are gasoline related to the asphalt plant, if there smells like that, I'm starting to get some equipment together to try to monitor that. I have a VOC reading thing, and I'm trying also to explore doing some whole air capturing for analysis for components. And I think that, right, Scott Andrews is on here, so that if, right, I think you all have the ability to look at air toxins as well. Thank you, Katasha, and thanks everybody. Thanks especially to Mr. Weekly and to Ms. Sharon for hosting these black carbon monitors.
Yeah, I just want to second that. Like, shout out Stan, he's over on 16th Street, and Sharon, she's on 13th Street. They both been hosting both purple air monitors and the black carbon monitors, so we really appreciate it. And there's a couple of residents also on the call, John, Rodrigo, who've been hosting so purple air monitors. So thank you all so much for continuing to do that. We really appreciate that, and it's really helpful getting, you know, community science going in our neighborhood. So any questions for Zooks? If you want, you can put those in the chat, but we have one minute, so I just wanted to make sure. Okay, awesome. So we have 2 more updates. We're actually running ahead of schedule, if you can believe that. So the next one is from Shay and Sarah from Foley and Hoag. They're gonna introduce themselves as our new attorneys and firm. And I think they have an announcement of a plain amicus brief. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Shay.
Sure, and I'll kind of let Sarah get into the details. But again, we're really excited to be working with the group. As you guys know, there's been some litigation filed relating to the failure to adequately analyze the environmental impacts of the bus terminal. And we've been kind of brainstorming ways to get involved. Litigation has been going on for a little bit. And so, we're kind of coming in after some things have already progressed. But Sarah can kind of debrief here on what our thinking is and what our kind of what our tentative plan might be moving forward. Sarah, I'll flip it over here.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Main. I'm an associate at Foley Hoag. I had the pleasure of meeting some of you, at the last meeting in August, but it's nice to see some more faces here. As Shay mentioned, we represent Empower DC, and we the case is now on appeal to the DC Court of Appeals. Empower DC is not a party to this litigation. So we took a look at the case below that was dismissed at the trial court. And now that the case is on appeal to the Court of Appeals, we have an opportunity to submit what is called an amicus brief. And that provides an opportunity for a non-party to tell the court how the court below got the case wrong and provide some extra arguments to support the plaintiffs in this case. There's a benefit to filing an amicus brief in that it gives us some more pages for the court to consider in addition to the argument that the plaintiffs are making on appeal. So we are working on putting together that brief. There's a really short timeline for that. It'll likely be submitted around close to the end of the month, but it really depends on some of the court procedural timelines. But that is a short turnaround time, and we're working on that. Our main thinking is that the court below dismissed the case for the wrong reason, primarily that the plaintiffs don't have what the court calls standing, which is basically proving that the court can redress the injuries that the plaintiffs have asserted. That is, by bringing the case, there is an outcome that the court can provide to alleviate the injuries. So the fact that the city did not start the environmental review process until after the project had already begun its initial stages, including construction on the site. We think there's a strong argument that the procedural deficiencies there have caused harm to the plaintiff, and the court below got the answer wrong. So that's our thinking. It's been really helpful to hear the air quality analysis and flaws that the city, I guess, overlooked in that analysis, particularly because that's part of what we think they should have looked at in the first instance before approving the project. So I'm happy to take any questions. It's just a very high level overview.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Thanks, Jay. Does anyone have questions for them right now? Well, you can always add your questions to the chat. We have the Georgetown University Law School. So Lindsay Bailey, I know Sarah had to sign off. So it's I think you're going to introduce the students and a brief overview of the project, so we can get back to all the legal questions after that.
Yeah, lawyers love talking about the legal questions, unfortunately. I'm going to actually just turn it over to my students to introduce themselves and the project.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having us tonight. We're, as Lindsay mentioned, students in the Georgetown Environmental Law and Justice Clinic. I'm Jessie, and my colleagues Steve and Grace are here as well. They'll wave. And along with our supervisors, Professors Colangelo and Bailey, we're working with PRISA this term on an environmental justice action plan. So our hope is to create more legal tools and strategies for Empower DC to address environmental injustices. We've been listening in on tonight's meeting and doing a lot of research, and I spoke with PRISA to get a better sense of the issues facing the community. And I'll turn it over to Steve now to talk a bit more about the plan.
Thanks, Jessie, and thank you for having us, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. So for the Environmental Justice Action Plan, we'll be looking at community survey and health monitoring data in order to recommend some strategies for addressing community concerns. Some of the strategic options that we'll have for advocacy might include strengthening existing laws, enacting new laws or regulations, asking the city to ramp up enforcement or to design new enforcement regimes, looking at land use and zoning changes, and also some better governance proposals such as an interagency working group or an intergovernmental process for environmental justice, and incorporating environmental justice concerns into city policy and city operations. So that's kind of what we're looking at. Again, we'd really like to thank you for having us tonight, and we'll continue to keep listening and taking in everything we can. And with that, I think I'll kick things back to Katasha.
Great. Thank you all. We have a couple of questions in the chat. So Zooks asks, well, how can we help? So the legal effort, what can we do?
So I can field, and then Georgetown folks, by the way, we should be coordinating, but you can field too. But yeah, so I mean, I think so at the stage we're at in the current litigation is what we call like a purely legal question, more or less. And so we're in this like appeals level. Again, we're getting into this a little bit late in the game. The court, I think as Sarah highlighted, doesn't even necessarily have to listen to us on this because we're kind of interjecting as a third party. But here we're just going to be arguing about fairly nuanced issues of law. If we're successful in steering the court in the right direction, and I do think the law is on our side here, then the case will continue, and there'll be a lot of room for facts back when we get to the trial court. The good news about kind of where we're at on all this, though, is that this isn't kind of the end. So what we're arguing about right now is whether DC should have, at an earlier point in time, conducted an environmental analysis before proceeding with the project. But DC actually has more recently began to conduct a separate environmental analysis of the project. So apparently they've started on an environmental impact assessment of some sort, and we're not sure what the status is because they haven't published anything. So when that process is completed, regardless of whether we win or lose the current litigation, we'll have a chance to challenge their conclusions with respect to their current evaluation as well. So there is kind of another cut at this, we expect, at least one other one. And then there also should be some procedure around the air permit that we think the bus terminal is going to need to open up. And so there's a couple of other, avenues where I think the facts around the health impacts to the community will be relevant, and we'll have a chance to kind of use that information in the legal context. So certainly, keep working hard on that stuff. And I think, again, it would be great to open up dialogues outside of these group calls and start coordinating and brainstorming together. And Georgetown folks, I don't know if you had anything to add to that, but please feel free.
Yeah. There was another question in the chat. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. Anyone else, anything else we can do? Sorry, I just want to make sure we fully exhausted that question. Okay. There was a question about what is the timeline for the brief? So Sarah.
Yeah, so the amicus brief is due 7 days after the plaintiffs filed their brief, which is due by the 21st of September. So that's why I said it's kind of a moving target. We know it'll be submitted before the end of the month, but it really depends on when plaintiffs resubmit their brief, which there's a little bit of a procedural step there that has to be cleared. So plaintiffs will file their brief, and we're coordinating on that timeline, and our brief will be submitted shortly thereafter, definitely by the end of the month.
Great, thank you for that. Carol?
Hi, thanks, Katasha. Yeah, I was just following up on what you guys can do. One of the things I was thinking about is, and I'm at the National Health Disparities Conference in Charleston, South Carolina, which is fabulous. So next year, if any of you, anybody, if you want to try to come here, you guys would love some of the speakers here at the conference. One of the things I was thinking about is, Katisha, how can we change or articulate what you guys want? And I think one of the challenges is for you to be able to talk about that you want to reduce pollutions, more specifically, as opposed to shut down a permit or close something, to try to connect to some of the things that Susan's talking about, that could be helpful for your group to start to message about just reducing air pollution and PM pollution to residents, right? I think because we can connect that to the health data. So it's because it's not really about, when we think about there's lots of other things that DOE can't do, or EPA. But there are things we can do when we're worried about people's health, right? So if you can think about more specifically as a group to have some of those conversations that you can bring up to both, EPA, DOEE, that would be helpful to kind of have, start to have your message be in a way that it helps us to be able to move that story along. Because sometimes we get stuck in the regulatory legal parts of permits. And I think some of the other discussions that we've talked about tonight about your health survey that you're doing right now, or your purple air sensors, are different than that regulatory approach. But I think that could have an impact or provide a point for you to have a conversation. So that's just something for you guys to think about how you can do that.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Kara. And then I just want to acknowledge a comment that John made in the chat, and he said, it's infuriating to hear that they're doing the environmental analysis now because we asked for it years ago and they never, or basically refused to send it. So John, thanks for that comment. So are there any other questions or comments for our panelists? I want to thank Lindsay and the students from Georgetown, Professor Lindsay, I should say, and the students from Georgetown Law. Thanks so much for attending. Also, Sarah and Shay, thank you. It's good to see you guys again. I just want to remind everyone as we wrap up, the health survey, it's out. So for the residents on the call, I see some of you, please ask your neighbors to take the survey. If you haven't taken it, please take it. We need to get at least 200 respondents. We'll have it. I'll have paper copies of it at the cookout on Saturday. So please take the survey. I want to thank everyone for coming tonight. The presentations were excellent. Thank you all so much. We recorded this session, so those who showed up late, or if you want to send that to other, so you can review any information, it will be there for you. Thank you all and have a good night.